I was sent to prison by Rudy himself when I was 3 months pregnant. Before pleading guilty, I asked him for the last time whether I could avoid taking the blame. "You're pregnant. You can just apply for parole and won't suffer too much. But Yojo is different. She's in poor health. If she's sentenced to prison, she'll die. Just consider it as accumulating good fortune for the baby in your belly. I promise you that when you get out of prison, I'll marry you." I asked him, "You said before that I owed her a life. Have I paid it off now?" Rudy nodded and said that he would be grateful to me for the rest of his life. I signed the confession letter and had an abortion before going to prison. Later, Rudy went crazy and questioned me on what grounds I had aborted his child. "I won't let my child have a mother in prison and a cruel father. All the past right or wrong, just think that I was too stupid and naive. From this moment on, Rudy, we're even." On the day I was released from prison, no one came to pick me up. The prison guard sent me to the gate. Looking at the empty street outside, she asked me how I would leave. I didn't have a penny on me. The bag in my hand contained the few sets of clothes I had, and it was light. Just like my life. It had no weight at all. I squinted at the bright sunlight outside and smiled. There's always a way. Although I don't have money, I have my feet. The prison guard hesitated for 2 seconds and took out her wallet. "No need. My home isn't far from here. I can walk back quickly." I refused her kindness and set off on the road home with my luggage. I had expected that no one would come to pick me up when I was released from prison, so I had deliberately checked the map before going to prison. It took 2 hours and 17 minutes to walk from the prison to my home. It really wasn't too far. In a year and a half, the city hadn't changed much. The stadium that had been under construction before I went to prison was only half completed by now. While waiting for the red light, my eyes unconsciously stopped on the stroller beside me. The mother noticed my gaze and gave me a kind smile. So I also smiled and asked her, "How old is the baby?" 1 year old. "How cute." I bent down and made a face at the baby. The baby was lying in the stroller, waving its tiny fists and making a few cooing sounds. When the red light turned green, I straightened up and walked into the surging crowd. Before night fell, I finally arrived at my home. The old security door was covered with dust. I found the spare key in the mailbox at the door, opened the door and went inside. There was a portrait on the shoe cabinet. I picked it up, wiped the dust off it with my sleeve, and showed a very faint smile. "Mom, I'm home." It took me some time to reintegrate myself into society. Because I had a criminal record due to being in prison, I didn't have much luck finding a job. For a living, I found a job sorting express deliveries. After working for a week, I fainted directly in the warehouse and was sent to the hospital by my colleagues. I hadn't been able to take good care of myself after the abortion back then, and it had ultimately damaged my health. I couldn't afford to toss around like I did in previous years anymore. I could only resign and registered as a food delivery rider. I planned to save money for 2 years and then consider whether to start a small business. These days, undergraduates aren't worth much. Undergraduates who have been in prison are even less valuable. The job of a food delivery rider isn't easy either. But it's still better than that of a sorter. And it's relatively free. I think it suits me quite well. The income on the weekend was quite good. There was a big order just before I got off work, and the delivery fee was high. But the distance was a bit far. I estimated the power of my electric scooter, hesitated for a while, but still couldn't bear to give up this income and accepted the order. The destination was a club famous for its high prices. When I arrived at the club, I called the customer, and he asked me to deliver it directly to the private room. The takeout box was very big. I struggled to hold it, found the private room, and knocked on the door. "Hello. Here's your takeout. Please sign for it. Just put it here." The familiar voice made my eyelashes tremble. I silently followed the instruction and placed the box in the corner. The private room was lively, with a dozen men and women. The corner was piled up with boxes of various luxury goods. And there was a 3-tiered cake on the table in the middle, which was exquisite and luxurious. I wanted to leave after delivering the takeout. But unexpectedly, someone suddenly called out to me. "Hey, hadden så fel leid sig." Delivery rider. Wait a minute. My steps froze. Today is my birthday. Have a piece of cake. Thank you for delivering the takeout for us in the middle of the night. The woman standing in front of me had a charming face and reached out to me with a smile. Her name was Serafina. And she used to be my friend. A sharp pain grew in my heart, piercing deeply into my bones and blood, almost making me unable to speak. I reached out to take it and said thank you in a hoarse voice. When I turned to leave, I didn't notice the figure that had appeared behind me. It was too late to dodge when I wanted to. I could only watch helplessly as the piece of cake hit the other person's chest and soiled his shirt. Rudy looked down at his sticky chest, then at me, and didn't say a word. The private room fell silent at some point. Someone gloated and said, "I'm afraid this shirt is ruined. A shirt worth hundreds of thousands of yuan. Can you afford to pay for it?" "It's okay. Don't be afraid. You didn't do it on purpose. I won't ask you to pay for it. You can go." Serafina came over, gently soothing me while taking a tissue to wipe Rudy's shirt. Rudy stood still, just staring at me. The next second, he suddenly reached out and pulled off my helmet. Anyone's hairstyle won't look good after wearing a helmet for a long time. The private room was completely silent, and even the music stopped. I tidied my messy hair and reached out to Rudy. "Have you seen enough? Can you give me my helmet back?" "Are you Aline? You're out of prison? Why so soon? Weren't you sentenced to 3 years?" Finally, heading fulfilled Rydsai. Someone in the private room spoke up. I didn't pay attention and just calmly stared at Rudy. "Aline." Serafina saw this and quickly grabbed my wrist. "Why didn't you contact me after you got out of prison? I have so many things to tell you." I ignored her and just wanted to get my helmet back from Rudy. But Rudy wouldn't let go. I exerted a bit more effort and finally snatched back what belonged to me. "If you don't mind, please give me a 5-star review." I forced a smile at the corner of my mouth, put on my helmet again, and walked away. "Aline, don't you have anything to say?" Rudy's words successfully stopped me. I turned my head. My eyes fell on Serafina, and I said in a calm tone, "Serafina, happy birthday." Sure enough, on my way home, my electric scooter ran out of power. In the quiet late night, several luxury cars roared past me. I just looked at the road carefully, avoided the potholes, and focused on pushing the scooter. It was already early morning when I got home. I cooked a bowl of plain noodles for myself. By the dim yellow streetlight outside the window, I ate them silently in the alternating light and shadow. After eating, I still wasn't sleepy, so I took my mother's photo, sat by the window and talked to myself. "Mom, are you doing okay in that world? Have you received the paper money I burned for you? Have you met my child? Is he cute? Remember to help him find a perfect mother. Next time when he's reincarnated, don't be so unlucky to be born in my belly again. Mom, I miss you." That night, I rarely had a dream. Dreaming about the past, I hadn't dreamed for a long time. Probably the 1.5 years of prison life had completely smoothed out the little sharpness left in my bones. I seldom thought about the past. The life in prison was very regular. I got up, worked, ate, and slept at fixed times. It was very hard in the beginning. Every day, having day, I sat on the bed, opened my eyes and counted the seconds, waiting for dawn. Later, I got used to it. After that, I didn't think about anything anymore. People can't live too soberly. That's too painful. It's okay to live numbly. It doesn't matter if you can't feel happiness, as long as you're not too sad. It's just that the me in the dream was so vivid, with a smile full of vitality. So when I woke up, I felt a bit sad, wondering how I had become what I am now. The woman in the mirror had lifeless eyes. I looked at myself in the mirror from left to right, trying to force a more lively smile, when there was a knock on the door. I hadn't even had time to take off that forced smile, until I saw Rudy standing outside the door. My smile completely froze. Rudy saw that I didn't respond and had to take the initiative to speak. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" "Probably not." I held the doorknob and asked him, "What's the matter?" He handed me a business card. "Call this person. He'll arrange a job for you." Thank you for your kindness. But it's not necessary. He laughed. As if he was disdainful of my behavior of insisting on my self-esteem. Eileen. Don't push your luck. I just stared at him without saying a word. Rudy avoided my gaze. Although you aborted the child without discussing it with me. What I said back then still counts. I thought for a long time and finally remembered that before I went to prison. He had indeed made a promise to me. He said that when I got out of prison, he would marry me. Finally, heading thoughtfully. A smile appeared on my face. Rudy also visibly relaxed and added, don't be angry. Serafina also said that she's very grateful to you. Find a chance, and we can all. Rudy, that was just your one-sided promise. It doesn't count. I interrupted him, watching the expression on his face fade away bit by bit, and said softly, I'm not so cheap that I would be willing to marry a man who doesn't love me and has never even looked up to me. What I want, from the beginning to the end, is to be even with you too, even if it's at the cost of sacrificing my future. Rudy laughed. Before leaving, he said, Eileen, don't regret it. I soon understood the implication of his words. During the peak dining time, after I delivered an order, I found that my electric scooter parked by the roadside was gone. Along with the electric scooter, there were also more than a dozen undelivered takeout orders missing. I stood by the roadside, holding my phone, and looked at the street blankly. People were coming and going around, and everyone was in a hurry, as if there was nothing unusual. I could only call the customers one by one, compensate for their losses, and then called the police. The police said that the surveillance cameras in that area happened to be out of order. They would try their best to help me find my vehicle, but they couldn't guarantee that they would definitely find it. I walked out of the police station, looking at a series of complaints and negative reviews on my phone's backstage, and took a deep breath, then pulled the corners of my mouth weakly. There was still some money left in my card, which was enough for me to buy another electric scooter. But what if the second vehicle was also stolen? I squatted by the roadside in a daze for a long time until a little girl with a school bag on her back timidly patted me on the shoulder. Sister, what's wrong with you? She thought for a moment, took out a piece of candy from her pocket and handed it to me. Sister, have some candy. I smiled at her. Sister is a bit tired, so I'm squatting down to take a rest. Thank you. Thanks to that milk candy, I finally regained some energy. When I got home, I began to sort out my resume. Regular companies wouldn't hire me, but there were always some small companies that didn't have such high requirements. However, with my criminal record there, during each interview, I couldn't escape being questioned about this issue by the HR. You've been in prison? I nodded and said yes. The reason for being in prison was atonement? Yes. But you don't have a driver's license? Yes. Then the HR didn't say anything more. They just tactfully returned my resume to me, saying that they would still need to think about it. I remembered again that Rudy had told me at that time that Serafina was too weak to endure the hardship of being in prison. He had never considered that I didn't have a driver's license. Once convicted, I would be sentenced more severely for driving without a license. But actually, it was normal. I really couldn't expect someone who had never cared about me to consider things from my perspective. All of my job interviews came to nothing. In order not to sit around and eat away at my savings, I started to apply for jobs like waitressing. However, what I hadn't expected was that even for a job as a waitress, no one was willing to hire me. When I walked out of the last restaurant, it started to rain heavily. I stood at the entrance of the restaurant, looking at the rain falling from the eaves, and slowly walked into the rain. The rain wasn't too heavy. At least it wasn't enough to blur my vision. But my vision became blurred after all. It was probably a kind of grievance that made me feel aggrieved, but I didn't know who I could tell my grievances to. Rudy was standing downstairs of my house, waiting for me with an umbrella. I saw him from a distance, about 10 meters away. I stopped in my tracks and didn't want to move forward. He noticed me, lifted his feet and walked towards me, then stopped 3 steps away from me. Have you come to terms with the reality? He asked me. I looked at him seriously. Rudy, you said you would be grateful to me for the rest of your life. So? Gratitude isn't like this, I said. So you can't treat me like this. Maybe my mind was affected by the rain. So I didn't realize how feeble and powerless my words were. Of course he could treat me like this. I had nothing. I didn't have a family background that could compete with his. No wealth to support me. And I didn't even have relatives or friends. He could bully me, slander me, and impose one unfounded charge after another on me as he pleased. I just hadn't expected that he hated me so much that he wasn't even willing to leave me a way out. Finally, having fulfilled life, he walked up to me step by step. That umbrella blocked the pouring rain above my head. It also blocked all my light. In the dimness, Rudy reached out his hand, stroked my cheek, and told me that this was the price for me to break off all ties with him. Then what do you want me to do? I murmured and asked him. You don't want me to love you, or do you want me to break off all ties with you? So I can only choose to die, right? I had a warm dream. In the dream, I snuggled up in my mother's arms. She gently patted my back and coaxed me in a low voice, asking me not to cry. I sobbed softly and acted coquettously, saying, Mom, I'm in so much pain. She asked me with heartache where it hurt. My head hurts. My hands hurt. And my feet hurt too, I said, agreed to lie. Everything hurts and my heart hurts the most. Mom, life is so hard. Can I come to you? She just held me gently and didn't say anything. Then I knew that she didn't want me either. Who would want me? Nobody would want me. So, this dream ended. I opened my eyes and stared unfocusedly at the familiar ceiling above my head. After recovering from that moment of distraction, I slowly moved out of Rudy's embrace. He was startled and subconsciously hugged me tighter. When he met my gaze, he let go of me in a daze. I was able to crawl to the end of the bed and curl up. The room was very dark. I didn't know what time it was. It was just that Rudy's presence beside me made me feel very insecure. So I asked him, Can you leave? Perhaps the night softened the coldness around Rudy. He didn't seem as unfeeling as he was at the beginning. He just sighed and asked me what exactly I wanted to do. I thought blankly. What did I want to do? I just wanted to live a good life. But he didn't give me this chance. So I asked him instead, Rudy, what about you? What exactly do you want to do? He sat on the edge of the bed, with his back to the moonlight, and looked at me quietly. But I just lowered my eyes, stared at the simple patterns on the bed sheet, and said in a low voice, What else do you want me to do? I don't have anything left to give you. Don't you want to marry me? Rudy, I've never thought about marrying you, I smiled silently. How could I ever expect to marry you? Eileen, do you love me? I didn't understand why Rudy would ask this question. I thought that between him and me, from the beginning until now, this was the least important thing. But I still answered him. Rudy, I loved you. But not because you were rich or handsome. It was just because I thought you were a nice person. On the day my mother died in a car accident, I cried bitterly in the hospital. Many people passed by me. But only you gave me a handkerchief. Everyone thought that the first time I met Rudy was at the freshman social gathering in college. But that wasn't the case. I had met him when I was in senior high school. That was the darkest day of my life. During class, the head teacher suddenly called me out and said that something had happened to my mother. I rushed to the hospital in a panic, and all I saw was my mother's lonely and cold body. It was a car accident. The driver hit and ran. My mother didn't even have time to be sent to the hospital. She didn't even leave a last word before she left. We didn't have time to say goodbye to each other. When my father died, I was still young and I didn't feel the pain as clearly. But when my mother died, I was about to become an adult. That was the first time I clearly realized that sometimes the separation in life could be so sudden that God couldn't let everyone say goodbye properly. I hid in the stairwell and cried until I almost fainted. But such a scene was really common in the hospital. Every wall and every brick in the hospital had carried countless teardrops. Nobody dared to stop because their own lives were already hard enough and they didn't have the courage to share others' hardships. Stop crying. Your crying is giving me a headache. Someone sat down beside me and handed me a handkerchief. I kept sobbing, almost exhausted with sweat and tears mixing together, and my whole body was as wet as if I had just been fished out of the water. He took out a cigarette in front of me and asked if I minded. I just kept crying and didn't respond to him. He clicked his tongue and just held the cigarette in his mouth without lighting it. His mood wasn't affected by me at all. His tone was cold from beginning to end. Be more mature. Meeting is the beginning of parting. No matter how close to people are, one of them always has to leave earlier. Whoever leaves whom can still live well. It doesn't matter. He thought I was crying too loudly. But he stayed with me for a long time. At that moment, I just needed someone to accompany me. It was as if in the vast sea of people, even if I had to be alone from then on, I wouldn't feel too lonely. Finally, he was called away by someone else. Someone pushed open the door of the stairwell and called his name. Rudy, it's time to go home. Rudy got up, patted the dust off his body, and left without looking back. He didn't say goodbye to me. A chance encounter like that. It seemed that there was no need to say goodbye. But I remembered his name. Until the freshman social gathering in college. My new roommate Serafina walked over with his arm in hers, smiling and introducing to me. Aline, this is my boyfriend Rudy. From the strange look he gave me, I knew that he didn't have the slightest impression of me. But it didn't matter. I would always remember this kindness. I repaid this kindness to Serafina doubly. So Serafina and I became friends. Although sometimes I would regret it and wish that I hadn't met Rudy in the first place. He gave me a little bit of warmth, like a flickering spark on a cold winter night. But I paid the price of all my happiness in the rest of my life. Perhaps some things are really predestined. The cause of my mother's death was hit and run by the driver. The crime for which I was imprisoned and was also hit and run. Maybe God was using this way to tell me that the warmth that didn't belong to me that I had received would eventually have to be paid back. Rudy, do you know what was on my mind when I was sitting in the courtroom listening to the presiding judge's sentencing? You make me feel that I'm the driver who hit and killed my mother and then fled the scene back then. Enough. Stop talking. Rudy suddenly stood up. His tall figure in the darkness was like a terrifying monster, baring its ferocious fangs and wanting to swallow me whole. I curled up my limbs tightly, laughing while looking at him. Rudy, why are you angry? Is it because I aborted your child? Do you know how I aborted it? In the middle of the night when everyone was asleep, I bumped my stomach against the corner of the single bed. It was extremely painful. But it was very effective. I only bumped it twice and it was gone. At that time there was a lot of blood, but I endured until dawn before asking the police to take me to the hospital. I won't be able to have children anymore in the future. So although I've been in prison, I'm poor and useless. But finally I don't have to worry that a child related to me by blood will come into this world and suffer with me. Rudy approached me, grasped my ankles and pulled me towards him forcefully. I screamed and struggled, but he was really too strong. I could only be held tightly in his arms. No matter how I scratched, bit, or hit him, he wouldn't let go. Finally I was tired. The world was spinning around me, and I felt like I was going to die. Rudy, do you know why I'm saying these things? Because I'm a poor wretch that nobody wants. I can't compete with you. I can only remind myself over and over again by revealing my own scars that the price of loving you is too high for me to bear. Let me go. Or let me die. You choose one. Let's be straightforward and stop entangling with each other. Okay? But Rudy just held me tightly. One after another. He ordered me in my ear. Enough. Stop talking. His voice changed from deep to hoarse. Finally, having to fob my upside. It choked. When I woke up again I found myself in the hospital. My limbs were still weak and limp and my head felt heavy as if it were filled with cement. I met Rudy's gaze. He was sitting by the bedside staring at me intently. I calmly looked back at him. After a long while I turned over, with my back to him. Rudy gently lifted his hand and took out the infusion tube that was being pressed by me. Do you really want to be even with me? I didn't say anything. Then promise me one last thing. Hearing that I just wearily closed my eyes. No. Thanks. He had always gone back on his word. It was he who said back then that as long as I took Serafina's place in prison we would be even. Aline, Lenara lo fi. Do you hate me a lot now? Why do you always keep asking me how I feel about you over and over again? Does it matter? He asked me in return. Doesn't it matter? Well, it doesn't matter. You're right. It really doesn't matter. Rudy played with the lighter in his hand. I'm going to hold a wedding. And I'm still short of a bride. I opened my eyes. Marry me. And I'll set you free. It turns out that people can really laugh out of extreme anger. Rudy. Are you crazy? There are so many people who want to marry you. Why do you have to choose me? Have you forgotten how you cursed me for being shameless and climbing into your bed just to get into your family? You haven't clearly expressed your unwillingness to marry me. So all my pre-wedding preparations are based on you. Rudy said. I've spent a lot of money. And you can't afford to pay it back. I just felt it was absurd. Aline, why? You're not even afraid of death. Why don't you dare to bet with me one last time? Rudy got up, walked to the window, turned his head and looked at me deeply. What if you win the bet? I can also send you abroad. Your English is very good. And you won't have any problem living and communicating abroad. They don't know your past. Don't know that you've been in prison. You can completely start over. I didn't believe him at all, but I couldn't help the hope that rose in my heart. Will you really let me go? Really? But you clearly hate me. Rudy put the unlit cigarette back in his mouth again. Yeah. I hate you. But I said I'd marry you. I don't like to leave things half done. I've never been able to understand Rudy. Actually, it's quite normal. Even though we've done the most intimate things. We've never really known each other. We've never held hands or had a heart-to-heart talk. During the long years in college we weren't even friends. He was my roommate's boyfriend. A wealthy and handsome second-generation rich kid. I had always been sensible and kept a long distance from him. The closest moment was when we went to play in the haunted house together. He mistook me for Serafina. When I screamed in fright, he smiled and pressed my head against his chest, whispering, "Don't be afraid." Later, when he realized he had mistaken me for someone else, we just tacitly separated as if nothing had happened. Serafina often asked me what I thought of Rudy. I always told her that Rudy was nice and that they were a perfect match. They both came from outstanding families, had good looks, and had either calm or passionate temperaments. In every aspect, they were a match made in heaven. Really? Do you really think I match him well? Serafina propped her chin on her hand and asked me. Aline, Winell, don't you think you also match Rudy well? Serafina, don't make such jokes. Because I had never thought of having anything to do with Rudy. I had always been calm. Loving someone doesn't mean you have to be with them. Even loving someone doesn't necessarily have to have an ending. Rudy was my benefactor. And Serafina was my friend. I would be happy as long as they were happy. But later I found out that it was all just my own wishful thinking. Who was I? What qualifications did I have to be friends with these young masters and young ladies? At the graduation party, Serafina handed me a glass of wine with a smile. She said that she thanked me for tolerating her little temper during the 4 years in college. So she wanted to toast me. I took it, and took a small sip. The bitter taste of the wine made my expression whist. Serafina laughed. Before she could tease me, she was forcibly dragged away by other friends. Rudy happened to pass by. Seeing that I was holding a glass of wine, he casually asked, "Can you drink?" I shook my head and replied with a smile. "Not really. I seldom drink." "Then give it to me." I was just about to say that I had already drunk from this glass when Rudy had already drunk half of it. Seeing this, I could only swallow the words that were on the tip of my tongue. Rudy didn't leave after drinking the wine but chatted with me for a few more sentences. I was still wondering why he suddenly started talking to me since we weren't familiar with each other when I heard him say that he felt a bit uncomfortable and wanted to go back to his room to rest. I subconsciously wanted to contact Serafina. No need. I'm just a bit dizzy. Rudy frowned and undid the top button of his shirt. Today's a rare opportunity. Let her play. Don't disturb her. Then, shall I take you back to your room? I just asked politely. I thought Rudy would definitely refuse. But he just tilted his head and thought for 2 seconds. Then nodded. Then I'll trouble you. I helped Rudy back to his room. And then I couldn't leave. The glass of wine had been drugged. I had only tasted a little. But Rudy had drunk most of it. We spent a passionate night together. The next day, what greeted me was the discomfort and soreness all over my body, and the slap from Serafina full of hatred. I had been in self-doubt for a long time. I always thought that my morality wasn't that bad, and that I wouldn't do something like stealing someone else's love. I just couldn't figure it out. Why didn't I reject Rudy when I was rational and sober? I had only tasted a tiny bit of the wine. But it was enough to take away my reason. But this made the whole thing even worse. Drinking doesn't necessarily lead to losing one's self-control. But with ulterior motives. Rudy was made to drink the strong liquor laced with an aphrodisiac. My hidden intentions towards Rudy were obvious to everyone. I became a slut who would sleep with anyone, using any means to climb into Rudy's bed. And Serafina and Rudy were both poor people who were used and hurt by me. The wine glass was handed to me by Serafina. But she was kind and innocent and had always been sincere to me. How could she possibly do something like sending me to her boyfriend's bed? Rudy took the initiative to drink the wine. But he was just being kind. Wanting to help his girlfriend's roommate avoid drinking. Never expecting that I would be so despicable. They were noble and pure people. The embodiment of goodness. So the shameless and despicable person must be me. Could only be me. Serafina couldn't accept the fact that she was betrayed by both her boyfriend and her best friend. She once wanted to slit her wrists and commit suicide. She was discovered when she tried to do so and was rushed to the hospital. So they all said that I owed Serafina a life. Serafina was in a bad mood. Got drunk. And drove after drinking. Killing someone. Since I owed her. It was only right that I took the blame. And it just so happened that I was pregnant. So I deserved to die even more. I was the sinner. And the child in my belly would also be born with my sins. But Rudy was so merciful. He promised me that as long as I atoned for my sins, he would marry me and recognize the child. I desperately wanted to shout. But it seemed that I was surrounded by a vacuum, blocking all my chances to call for help. Was I wrong? Did I need to atone for my sins? Where was I wrong, and what sins did I need to atone for? Was my child also at fault? Did he also have to inherit my sins? I didn't want this. I accepted all the consequences. But I couldn't let my child be dragged down by me. He should be born into a family surrounded by love and have a bright future. A sharp pain started from my lower abdomen and spread to all parts of my body. On the night when I signed the confession letter, I stroked my lower abdomen for a long time. I had a miscarriage once. But I felt that the pain was no less than that of giving birth. When I was carried by the police and sent to the hospital, I could even laugh out loud. Maybe it was destined that I, Aline, would have no relatives. I was doomed to be alone all my life. I agreed to Rudy's request to marry him. He seemed to really value this wedding. Everything was the best. According to the wedding dress designer, my phoenix coronet and robe had been in production 2 years ago. Because the hand embroidery was time-consuming, they all worked overtime for nearly 3 months to barely complete it, a whole year ahead of the originally scheduled construction period. I was dazed for a few seconds. 2 years ago. I remembered that the mistake between Rudy and me also happened 2 years ago. Did he start arranging it so early? A strange thought flashed through my mind. But I didn't think too much about it. Rudy would ask for my opinion at first. After finding that I didn't care about any of those things, he stopped asking me. He decided on the style of the wedding invitations, the types of wedding candies, the specifications of the hotel. Actually, I wanted to say that it was just a fake wedding. And he didn't need to be so meticulous. But this wedding was unexpectedly grand. I don't understand Rudy. So I don't understand why he insisted on holding the wedding. Nor do I understand why the bride had to be me. But it doesn't matter. I don't need to understand him. I just hope that he can keep his promise. I want my freedom. On the wedding day, Rudy came to pick me up early. He was wearing a custom-made suit, followed by a large group of relatives, friends, and photographers. Standing among them, he looked especially handsome. I didn't have any relatives or friends, so the bridal chamber welcoming ceremony had to be simplified. But following the customs, Rudy carried me downstairs and into the wedding car. From beginning to end, my feet didn't touch the ground at all. I didn't see those people who had once spoken ill of me. Probably Rudy didn't want the atmosphere of his wedding to be ruined. I looked at the lily of the valley bouquet in my hand and showed a faint smile. Looking up, I found that Rudy was staring at me intently. So happy? He asked me. Do you think you're about to get your freedom and can't wait? Yes, Heading fulfilled my obsession. I nodded with a smile. I really can't wait. Outside the window was the scenery passing by quickly. I remembered the phone call I received last night. It was Serafina who called. Her laughter was harsh and shrill. She said she didn't expect that Rudy was still willing to marry a woman who couldn't have children. Do you know, Aline? I really hate you. The first time I saw you, I knew you were the kind of person I hated the most. You seem to be carefree and indifferent to everything on the surface. But you know how dark your heart is inside. You've always been coveting Rudy, right? You should thank me for that glass of wine, which gave you a legitimate opportunity. I had always known that it was Serafina who put the drug in the wine. If Rudy hadn't suddenly shown up and snatched away my wine glass, I didn't know which man would have been in my bed when I woke up the next morning. Or maybe, which man? Serafina. I'd asked myself, and I haven't done anything bad to you. You took Rudy away from me. How dare you say you haven't done anything bad? Without that glass of wine from you, I would never have had any contact with Rudy in my whole life. But Rudy loves you. Serafina went crazy. How could he love you? How can you compare to me? Why does he love you instead of me? I held my phone and became completely silent. Have you never thought about it this way? Don't tell me that you still think Rudy has always hated you until now. He doesn't hate you at all. He loves you so much that he's almost crazy. He defied everyone's wishes and insisted on having a wedding with you just for you. If he doesn't love you, what's he after? If drugging Rudy could make him sleep with other women casually, why do you think I didn't drug him before? He has been trained in this aspect since he was a child. His body has resistance to drugs. Ordinary aphrodisiacs have no effect on him at all. I hung up the phone directly. The wedding ceremony was held on the open lawn. The scene was decorated very warmly, with beautiful flowers and balloons everywhere. When I saw Rudy standing on the stage waiting for me, for a moment, I felt as if we had really been in love. The master of ceremonies held the microphone and asked him, Mr. Rudy, whether in poverty or wealth, in sickness or in health, are you willing to marry Miss Aileen? Love her and take care of her all your life until death parts you? Rudy looked at me and answered firmly, I do. Miss Aileen, are you willing? I held the microphone, stared fixedly at Rudy, and opened my mouth to answer, I'm not willing. There was an instant uproar among the audience. The smile on Rudy's face disappeared completely. He stared at me with a gloomy face. I took off the crown on my head and repeated, Rudy, I'm not willing to marry you. I won't marry a man who raped me, made me go to prison, and even once cut off my way of living. I lifted my skirt, pulled out the small knife tied to my leg, and pressed it against my neck. Aline. Finally. A look of panic appeared on Rudy's face. His arm trembled as he wanted to stop me. Stay away from me. I took a few steps back warily. The knife accidentally scratched Rudy's arm in the panic and then was pressed against my chest again. I won't marry you. I won't be with you. Rudy. Make your choice now. Do you want me to die or let me go? The people in the audience rushed over but didn't dare to really get close to us. Rudy didn't cover his injured arm. He just looked at me silently. Since he didn't say anything, I pushed the knife a little deeper. Slowly, blood soaked through the wedding dress. Rudy's lips trembled, and finally, he closed his eyes and growled, Go. I let out a bleak laugh. How ridiculous. When Rudy handed me the handkerchief, I didn't think he would love me. When he held me in his arms and said don't be afraid, I didn't think he would love me. When he pestered me and demanded my body again and again, I didn't think he would love me. When he insisted that I be his bride, I didn't think he would love me. When Serafina said Rudy loved me, I didn't believe a single punctuation mark of it. But at this moment, when I realized that my safety could actually be the only weakness that could threaten Rudy, I finally believed that Rudy really had feelings for me. But how ridiculous. I had gone through so many hardships. And all these hardships actually came from his love. How could I accept this? That wedding finally ended in chaos. Rudy was rushed to the hospital. And I got the freedom I had dreamed of. If this was a battle, unfortunately, having fulfilled me, there was no winner. I bought another small tombstone in front of my mother's tomb. There was no photo or name on the tombstone. I submitted my resume again. This time, without Rudy's obstruction, I successfully got a job in a company and started a new life. When night fell, I left the company and bought myself a portion of strawberries before going home. There was a faint smell of grass in the air. The harsh winter was coming to an end. Spring was coming. The end. Rudy's extra story. When Rudy was 8 years old, his mother died and was sent to the funeral parlor for cremation. There were fierce arguments among the adults around him, all for the inheritance and interests. He stood alone in the corner with a cold face, not saying a word. Want some candy? At some point, a little girl appeared beside him. She had beautiful braids and big round eyes. Looking at him innocently, there was a white rabbit creamy candy lying quietly in her outstretched palm. Rudy didn't know her, so he didn't want to pay attention to her. My dad is also in there, the little girl said, pointing at the huge furnace used for cremation. Mom said that when people die, they go to another world. No, Rudy said stiffly. The little girl didn't understand. Huh? Dead is dead. There's no other world. You don't have your dad anymore. Then dad won't come back to see me, right? The little girl pursed her lips a bit sadly. Rudy felt that he was really mean. When he saw his peer showing sadness, he felt that the heaviness in his heart was instantly relieved a little. It seemed that the sadness was transferred from himself to others in an invisible way. Who's the one in the furnace for you? The little girl asked again. Rudy opened his eyes and let out a shallow sigh. It's my mom. The little girl opened her eyes wide and looked at Rudy. After a while, she stood close to Rudy and gently held Rudy's hand. Don't be sad. Maybe my dad and your mom can be friends. Even if they're dead, they can also.